All right. Well, thanks, Gwen, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'm excited to be here with you to talk about White House brides. Just really quickly, I'll tell you about me. My name is Valerie Gugala. I'm coming to you from the Chicago area. And that on the screen there is my email address and my website in case you wanted to reach me. Feel free to email me if you want to, or my website, I do have some suggested readings for some of the topics that I talk about. I do have some on first ladies and presidents, so you can check out that if you're interested too. I've been a speaker for 25 plus years around the Chicago area and branching out into across the country thanks to Zoom. So that's enough about me. Let's talk about the topic at hand. So there have been 19 couples that have documented weddings at the White House. 9 of those were children of presidents. 3 were nieces or nephews of the president or first lady. 2 of them were siblings of the first couple. There were 2 staffers and 1 granddaughter, 1 friend, and actually 1 president were all married in the White House. Of the 12 children of presidents who were married during their father's presidency, 12 of them were married in places other than the White House. So we're not including them in this presentation. This is just ones that had a wedding or reception in the White House. Public weddings in the White House, especially those of presidents' children, have always been sort of feel-good occasions for the country and the president, and it would cast the president in a sympathetic role as father. So cynically, some supporters or staffers of the president would say, hey, it's good for polls. These events are occasionally referred to in the press as America's royal weddings. The president is invoiced for the private event at his personal expense. So when a president hosts a wedding, for example, we'll talk about Naomi Biden's wedding at the end of the presentation. The Biden family paid for the expenses of the flowers. They paid for all the food. They paid for the cake. They would pay for a special event staffing if there needed to be special event staff at there. And also if there was overtime for staff in the White House, they would be responsible to pay for that. But if, for example, the White House butler works on the wedding as part of his daily activities, that's just part of his job, and they don't pay for that. They don't pay for calligraphy staff that might fill out the invitations. That's part of their regular job. But in general, the president does pay for the costs of the wedding because it is private entertaining. That is true actually for any private entertaining that a president or first family does in the White House. If it's official entertaining, they have a banquet hosting, say, the Prime Minister of Japan, that's paid for by the country. But if he has a dinner with a personal friend, that's on his dime, if that makes sense. So let's talk about the weddings themselves. So we'll start with weddings in the 19th century. And the very first wedding that was held in the White House was held on March 29th, 1812. The bride was Lucy Payne Washington, who was the sister of Dolly Madison. And she married Supreme Court Justice Thomas Todd. And like I said, theirs was the first wedding in the White House. Now, this wedding seemed like it was a little bit spontaneous because Dolly wrote to her father to announce the wedding coming up, saying the event was, quote, unexpected and caused distress. But Dolly preferred the groom, the prospective groom, to the, quote, gay flirts who courted Lucy. Don't forget that gay back then meant happy or carefree. Dolly described Thomas as estimable and a very rich, very handsome man. So those were probably qualities that endeared her for a prospective groom for her sister. The White House wedding was held on the state floor, probably in the Blue Room. Lucy was attended by 3 bridesmaids, a Miss Hamilton, a Miss Hay, and Dolly herself. And the groom had 3 groomsmen, Payne Todd, who was Dolly's son, John Payne, who was Lucy and Dolly's brother, and a Mr. Edward Coles. And the Reverend McCormick presided. Now, according to the website Heroes, Heroines in History, Dolly was both the host and a bridesmaid. She entranced the guests with her preening airs, and she stole the show from the bride and was described as every inch the queen. I would bet that Dolly Madison would have stole the spotlight from just about any bride, being who she was. But the next bride at the White House was March 9th, 1820. Maria Hester Monroe, who was 17 at the time, married her first cousin, Samuel Gouverneur. Maria was the daughter of President James Monroe and First Lady Elizabeth Monroe, and Samuel was private secretary to the president as well as Elizabeth's nephew. It was the first wedding of a child of a president in the White House. And Maria's elder sister, Eliza, who was assuming the duties of First Lady because of their mother's poor health, decided that the wedding would be small and private. And that snubbed a lot of people and stirred up a lot of resentment in Washington. 42 guests attended a ceremony in the Blue Room, followed by dinner in the State Dining Room. 10 days later, Commodore Stephen Decatur hosted a larger reception for the newlyweds. Now, today we don't have any knowledge as to what Maria's wedding ensemble was, but a few things tell us what she might have worn. The Monroe girls were very into French style, and their mother, Elizabeth Monroe, purchased gowns made in Paris. Paris was then, as it is now, the fashion capital of the world. So it's possible that Maria had repurposed a white satin gown that she wore to a New Year's Eve celebration that year and wore that as her wedding gown. There is another account that described Maria wearing a light blue stiff silk dress with intricate embroidery of real wheat stalks. This is a drawing of the ball that was held in honor of their wedding. Gives you an idea of kind of the style of dresses that women were wearing at that time. It's that empire style with puff sleeves, high waistlines, and loose floor-length skirts. I have another example here. These are two other examples of styles of the time. They are not dresses that belong to the Monroe girls. They're just dresses of the time, but they show that high waist style, kind of the Bridgerton style. If you happen to watch the show Bridgerton, it's that style. All right, the next bride was February 25th, 1828. And John Adams II, the son of President John Quincy Adams, married his first cousin, Mary Catherine Helen, in the Blue Room. Now, Mary had come to live with the Adamses after her parents had passed away, and she became romantically involved with each of the three Adams brothers in turn. Ultimately, she broke off an engagement to George and turned to John then. Now, the mother of the three brothers, Louisa, insisted that John and Mary wed. And according to Heroes, Heroines in History, the whole affair of Mary going from brother to brother really worried the First Lady sick, and the brothers never got over it. Louisa may not have been wrong in her suspicions. The newlyweds' first child was born exactly 9 months after the wedding. So maybe it's a good thing that Louisa insisted that the two of them marry. Mary was 22 years old and had attended the previous White House wedding of Maria and Samuel, and it's reported that this wedding was similar to that wedding. The next wedding was December 1st, 1831. The groom was Andrew Jackson Jr., son of President Andrew Jackson, and he married Sarah York in Philadelphia on November 24th, 1831, and they held a reception in the White House on December 1st. They were married in Philadelphia, and although President Jackson did not attend the ceremony, according to the National First Ladies Library, he greeted Sarah with literally open arms on the north portico, commencing a series of dinners and receptions to which she wore her wedding gown, which was lace and silk boat neck with a basque waist. And this is her actual wedding dress. This is the first wedding dress of a White House bride that we actually have preserved to us through history. And you can see it does have that boat neck. It has what's called a bertha. That's the lace that is across the front of the dress. It's called a lace bertha. And you can see the embroidery on the dress there. You might wonder why we don't have some of these other wedding gowns left to us. It's because at the time, fabric was very expensive. Women didn't necessarily have a wedding dress that was only worn for their wedding. It might be made for their wedding and then they would wear it for other occasions after that, or sometimes they would just wear what was already their best dress. And when dresses went out of style, you didn't just get rid of it, you would maybe alter it to be in the new style, or maybe you would pass it down to a younger sibling or a child and it would be cut down to fit that person. And so a lot of the dresses from this time just don't exist anymore because the fabric was used until it couldn't be used anymore. Also at this time is when white wedding dresses were just coming into fashion, well, not even really. It was Queen Victoria who really started the fashion of white wedding dresses. White wedding dresses had been used especially by the richer people before Queen Victoria. But as I said at the time, you know, you didn't necessarily have a dress that was just your wedding dress. You would wear your best dress. And for many people, a white dress would be impractical to say the least. So it's after Queen Victoria's wedding that we really see white dresses come into fashion. So her dress is not white, although it's probably darkened with age. So anyway, let's move on to the next wedding, which was April 10th, 1832. It was between Mary Easton, who was a niece of Rachel Jackson, the late wife of President Andrew Jackson, and she married Lucius Polk in the East Room. Now, not much is known about this wedding, unfortunately. Lucius Polk had known Mary Easton from childhood, and he had tried unsuccessfully several times to win her heart. Polk was in Tennessee when he received word that Mary was engaged to a Lieutenant Bolton Finch, who was an officer in the U.S. Navy. Polk expeditiously traveled back to Washington and appealed to President Jackson, saying that he was in love with Mary and he had intentions for her. The president then spoke with Mary and is believed to have said, "Take care, my dear. Marriage with love is heaven. Without it, it's just hell." So days before her wedding was supposed to be to Lieutenant Finch, she changed her mind and married Mr. Polk instead. So apparently that's where her heart really was. Another wedding that we really don't have a lot of information about, unfortunately, is the wedding of Mary Ann Lewis and Alphonse Joseph Yves Pajot. Was November 29th, 1832. The bride, Mary, was the daughter of a close friend of President Jackson's. And this is the first wedding in the White House of an individual not related to the first family. This is also the only Roman Catholic wedding held inside the White House. The ceremony took place in the Blue Room. Supposedly, President Jackson just adored Mary Ann, who had lived with him in the White House as one of his legal wards. President Jackson had many, many legal wards over the years, children that were orphaned that he took in and took care of, and Mary Ann was one of them. He had tried to set her up with his son, Andrew Jr., but she fell in love with Alphonse, and so the president gave Mary Ann away at the ceremony. All right, now I have a trivia question. I love to put in the trivia questions. It gives me a chance to pause and get a little drink so I can keep talking. So I'll take a drink of my tea while you think about, you can type in the answer if you want to. Which president's daughter married a grandson of another president? Okay. I won't wait too long because we have a bunch to cover, but I'll give you a little bit of a chance if anybody wants to guess. It's okay if you don't, too. Oh, we have a couple people. Eisenhower and Nixon, says Marilyn, and Karen says Nixon's daughter. You are both right. Congratulations. Good job. I'm sure many of you may remember that Julie Nixon married David Eisenhower on December 22nd, 1968. Now, this date was after President Nixon had been elected, but before he actually took office. Julie and David decided they didn't want the publicity of a White House wedding. So they went ahead and got married in a church in New York City before her father was inaugurated. But I think that's really, really interesting that the daughter of a president and the grandson of a president were married. What a cute couple they were. All right, the next White House wedding we have to talk about is between Elizabeth, known as Lizzie Tyler, and William Waller. It took place January 31, 1842. And Elizabeth was the daughter of President John Tyler and the First Lady, Letitia Tyler. Now, John Tyler was kind of an unpopular president at that time, and this is kind of the first example of a president maybe using a wedding to his advantage. He used invitations to this wedding as a show of friendship, and he invited many political guests to this wedding. So it's not only modern politicians that might use an event like this to boost their poll numbers, so to speak. This was probably the first wedding that was held in the East Room. Until then, it was mostly in the Blue Room. Now, unfortunately, the First Lady, Letitia Tyler, was very ill at this time, and her attendance at the wedding was her only public appearance. Sadly, she died later in 1842. Lizzie's sister-in-law was the surrogate White House hostess. Her name was Priscilla Cooper Tyler, and she planned the wedding with friends and family being the only guests that she invited. The president invited political guests. Now, like Maria Monroe, there are no images of Elizabeth in her wedding dress, but newspapers noted that the bride looked surpassingly lovely in her wedding dress and long blonde lace veil. Now, neither of these pictures is unfortunately her actual dress, but these both show a dress that is similar to what she could have worn. Both of them are made from taffeta and blonde lace, and it's depicting the style of this time. Also, they're both, well, when they were made, they were both white. Now they're cream because of age. As I mentioned, white was really coming into fashion because of Queen Victoria. All right. The next wedding is the wedding of a president, which I'm mentioning even though they weren't married in the White House because it is the wedding of a president. It is President John Tyler and Julia Gardner. There's only two presidents who've been married during their term. This is the first. The president and Miss Gardner were married June 29th, 1844 in New York at the Church of Ascension, and they did hold a reception a few days later. Like I said, I'm just kind of throwing it in there because it is an actual president getting married. The next actual White House wedding was Nellie Grant and Algernon Sartoris. They were married May 21st, 1874. Nellie was the 18-year-old daughter of President Ulysses Grant, and she married Algernon in the East Room. The groom was 23 years old, and he had a reputation as a womanizer. That led General Grant to question whether he should allow this marriage, but he eventually agreed. The magazines and newspapers of the time were full of details about the wedding. The June 6th issue of Harper's Weekly describes some of the gifts that were received. There was a dessert service of 84 pieces given by Mr. George Childs and a complete dinner service by Mr. A.J. Drexel, the combined value of the two being $4,500. Harper's also states that the couple received a, quote, little gift of $10,000 from President Grant and a silver Tiffany fruit dish that the bride swooned over. I think a lot of brides would swoon over a silver dish from Tiffany's. There were about 250 guests that attended the wedding. A platform was built in the East Room to hold the wedding on so that all of the guests could see the ceremony. The stage was flanked by white columns wreathed with flowers, over which was a floral arch bearing a swinging marriage bell of white roses. From this arch, wreaths of flowers were carried to cover the windows, forming a bower, and the backs of which was the monogram of the happy pair. These are some of the illustrations from Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated, showing different scenes from the wedding. And in the middle there, we have a copy of the invitation that was sent to guests. In the Frank Leslie's illustration, you can see some of the pillars and some of the flower wreaths that were hanging from them. Now, this engraving depicts the wedding party, but the woman in the large illustration in the middle is not the bride. That is the bride's mother, Julia Grant. And the gentleman in the large portrait is not the groom. That is the best man, the bride's brother, Frederick Grant. The women around them are the 8 bridesmaids. So I find this illustration a little odd, that it shows the bridesmaids and the mother of the groom and the brother of the groom. I don't understand why it doesn't show the bride and groom, but I just have to show it because I think it is so odd. The bridesmaids, the 8 of them, wore lustrous white silk gowns with tulle overlaying them in a pleated ruffle fashion and a poof in the back of the skirts. 4 of the ladies were decorated with blue flowers and the other 4 with rose pink flowers. And it was an English tradition at the time for grooms not to have any groomsmen beside a best man. And Algernon stayed to that tradition and just had Frederick as his best man. Excuse me. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the ceremony began. We have an illustration of the ceremony there. Algernon wore a black evening suit and appeared the embodiment of health and happiness, according to the newspaper. His best man, Frederick Grant, stood beside him in military uniform. Nellie's dress was described by the newspapers as white satin with a comet-like train trimmed with a set of point lace made in Brussels at a cost of $5,000. By the way, that would be about $92,000 today. It was arranged in a wavy horizontal line across the front of the skirt of the dress and interspersed with white flowers, green leaves, and miniature oranges. The bridal wreath was of white flowers and green leaves of the most delicate kinds. She wore white high satin shoes bearing water stripes from the toes upwards. She wore a pearl and diamond necklace with a locket and earrings, a long tulle veil attached to her hair with blossoms, long white gloves, and she carried a lace fan, a bouquet, and a handkerchief. After the ceremony, guests were led through the library into the dining room, where satin menus were placed at each place setting, and the centerpiece of the table was the cake, crowned with a bouquet of delicate white flowers, arranged in the highest style of art. This is another ceremony that I just want to throw in as a mention because it did take place in the White House, but it's technically not a wedding, it's a renewal of vows. President Rutherford B. Hayes and his wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, held a renewal of their vows on December 30th, 1879 in the White House. And Mrs. Hayes caused a sensation at this renewal by wearing her bridal dress, which you see there in the photograph, which was definitely out of fashion at the time, but she still went ahead and wore it. So I just wanted to mention it as an event that connected to weddings that happened in the White House, but not part of our official count of 19. The next one of our official count happened on June 19th, 1878. Emily Platt was the bride. She was the niece of President Rutherford Hayes, and she married Russell Hastings, and they were married in the Blue Room. The groom was a general in the Army who had been a member of the staff of General Sherman. The Hastings Platt wedding was a quiet affair. The only pictures from it that I could find is this picture of the actual invitation that was sent to guests. Now, Emily Platt had been like a daughter to the president and Mrs. Hayes, and had lived with them in the White House from the time they moved there up until her marriage. There were no bridesmaids, and the guests were few in number. The guests included cabinet officers and their families, a few relatives of the bride and groom, and a few members of Congress, among them Major William McKinley and his wife. The blue parlor was decorated for the occasion with potted geraniums and fuchsias in full bloom and foliage plants, and also with cut flowers. From a horizontal bar across the south side of the room was suspended a very large marriage bell of white roses and other fine flowers. A rope of green hung on either side, and in each festoon was a hoop of white flowers. In the center of one were the bride's initials, and in the other were the initials of the groom. The bride's dress was an ivory-tinted brocade, and her veil was of tulle. The ceremony took place at 7 in the evening, and an elaborate supper followed, after which the president's carriage took the bridal couple to the depot for a train to New York. The next wedding is the second wedding of a president, and this one took place in the White House. It was the wedding of President Grover Cleveland and Miss Frances Folsom. It took place June 2nd, 1886. It is the only wedding of a president to take place in the White House. Now, Frances, the bride, was the daughter of Oscar Folsom and Emma Folsom. She was an only child. Frances's father was one of 6 children whose family was relatively wealthy. Her father had a friendship with who would eventually become President Cleveland. That friendship began in Buffalo, New York. In fact, it was Cleveland who provided the family with Frances's first baby carriage. And several weeks after Frances's birth, Cleveland and another partner in Cleveland's law firm visited the Folsoms, and the story is told that it was on this occasion that Cleveland would hold in his arms the child that would 22 years later become his bride. A year after Frank, as she was called, was born, Grover became a partner with her father, and they began to practice law together. Now, when Frances's father died, she was 9 years old, and Cleveland became the administrator of her father's estate, although he was never her legal guardian. He guided her education, and when she entered Wells College, he asked Mrs. Folsom's permission to write to her, and it said that he kept her room bright with flowers. Now, Frances and her mother did not attend Cleveland's presidential inauguration in March of 1885 because Wells College refused to let Frances miss any classes. But she did graduate from Wells that spring, and she soon accepted Cleveland's proposal of marriage, despite 27 years difference in age. Speculation arose about the marriage prospects for the first bachelor president since James Buchanan, and the speculation quickly focused on Mrs. Folsom. Mrs. Folsom and Frances went to Europe in late 1885, and the press was absolutely positive that the trip was so that Mrs. Folsom could buy a wedding trousseau. When Frances and her mother returned to New York, the ship was besieged by press, and the next day, the White House issued a statement that the president was not engaged to Mrs. Folsom. He was engaged to her daughter, Frances. Frances was 21 years old when she married the 49-year-old president. The wedding of Cleveland and Frances took place on June 2nd, 1886. The president wanted to have a quiet wedding, so only 31 guests were invited. They were married in the Blue Room. It was decorated with numerous flowers and other houseplants. And the wedding's date was inscribed in a flower bed, written out in an arrangement of white pansies, and the initials CF for Cleveland and Folsom were written with white roses. The fireplace was filled with flowers in the color of fire, which I just think is so original. and such a neat little touch that you would put red flowers in the fireplace. The phrase E pluribus unum was written on a scroll above the main doorway. The East Room was decorated with palms, ferns, azaleas, and hydrangeas. Cleveland himself led Francis down the aisle. They went down the aisle at 6:30, walking down the grand staircase and across the hall into the Blue Room. Cleveland had asked that the ceremony be shortened, and he also ensured that the word obey was removed from the bride's wedding vows. He replaced it with the word keep. John Philip Sousa led the Marine Band in a rendition of the Wedding March, and the wedding ring was inscribed with the date. The ceremony only lasted 10 minutes, and at the end of it, a 21-gun salute was performed. Frances, after she was married, became the youngest presidential spouse in American history, and she still holds that title. This is Frances in her wedding gown. The dress was made of silk, satin, and fine muslin, and newspapers called it elegant and charming. The skirt was made of heavy ivory satin and was said to be stiff enough to stand alone. It was stiffened at the hem and reinforced with bone stays that, when fastened, created a birdcage bustle effect. The jacket draped at the waist. The bodice was of the same heavy satin fabric as the skirt. The sleeves reached to just below her elbows where they met her gloves. She had muslin scarves that were attached at the shoulder seams and crisscrossed her bodice. And she had a satin dicky with a low collar inside the V of the bodice. It is believed that her dress was designed by Worth of Paris. Her veil that you can see in the drawing there of the ceremony was made of tulle and was more than 6 yards long. The train of the dress was rounded at the hem and was attached by hand stitching to the back of the bodice. The gown was heavily ornamented with orange blossoms sewn along the cross seams of the bodice and the skirt, as well as along the hem. Orange blossoms and leaves were attached at points formed by the sleeve's hem at the elbow, and flowers and myrtle were entwined in the veil. The president wore a black broadcloth suit and leather shoes. He had a white glove on his left hand, carrying the other. In his lapel was a white rose, and he wore a white necktie. And the dress that you see on the screen there is Frances's dress today on display. Unfortunately, it can't be decorated with the flowers like it was when she wore it, but it still gives you an idea of what the dress looked like. After the wedding, they held a supper in the East Room. The centerpiece was a model ship made of flowers, flying the national colors, and flags bearing the initials CF. Slices of wedding cake were given to guests in individual satin boxes with cards signed by the bride and groom. After the wedding, the Clevelands went on honeymoon for a week in Deer Park, Maryland, where they were closely followed by reporters who intruded on their privacy. When they returned to the White House, they did hold 2 receptions, one of which was open to the public. During these receptions, Frances wore her wedding dress, her sapphire diamond engagement ring, and her diamond necklace, which she received as a present from the president. And the White House was decorated in the same style as it had been for the wedding. The second reception was held on June 18th for the public, and it said that the line of people waited by the White House for an hour before the event began, with thousands of people attending. All right, weddings in the 20th century. We have on February 17th, 1906, the wedding of Alice Lee Roosevelt, the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, and she married Nicholas Longsworth in the East Room. Alice is one of my favorite children of the presidents. She is quite the character. She was the only daughter of Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt. Her mother was President Roosevelt's first wife. Alice was born February 12th, 1884. Her mother and her paternal grandmother died 2 days later, which just devastated Theodore Roosevelt. Alice was intelligent, stubborn, and strong-willed. She had a reputation as a rule breaker at a time when women were under significant pressure to conform. She was known for things like smoking on the White House roof, carrying a snake in her purse, driving around Washington in a fast red car, and betting at horse races, all of which were shocking for a young lady of her time. The head usher of the White House later said that Alice had a party every night of her stay in the executive mansion. When her father was governor of New York, he and his wife said that they wanted Alice to attend a conservative school for girls. Alice wrote to them, "If you send me, I will humiliate you. I will do something that will shame you. I tell you I will." And Theodore Roosevelt once famously said about Alice, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." Alice was the first daughter to serve as a Goodwill ambassador during a 1905 congressional trip to Asia. She was the #1 story on the trip for all of her antics. For one example, she smoked pipes of Japanese tobacco, and she jumped fully clothed into the ship's swimming pool. These are some pictures of her on that trip. When she returned from the trip, she announced her engagement. On February 17th, 1906, she married Republican Representative Nicholas Longsworth of Ohio. The wedding took place in the White House, and Alice said about her father, "He wants to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening," which prompts the question whether father and daughter competed to be the center of attention at this wedding. The wedding was attended by more than 1,000 guests, with many thousands more gathered outside, hoping for a glimpse of the bride. Now, Alice's wedding gown was made exclusively of American materials. It had a heavy satin foundation with corded satin along the seams. Rare old point lace trimmings on the bodice and sleeves were embellished by clusters of orange blossoms. She had a 4-yard train in white brocade satin in a lily pattern that trailed behind her. In an attempt to make sure that Alice's gown could not be copied, the loom cards used to create the brocade weaving pattern were destroyed when the fabric was completed. Now, I will mention that this quote I got about what her dress looked like came from a newspaper, but I've read other quotes that said that Alice's dress was actually blue, not white. And I was giving this presentation a couple of months ago, and afterwards, someone came up to me and said that their grandmother had worked on Alice's dress and that it absolutely was blue. So I found that really interesting. I have a feeling it was a very light blue, that maybe in some light might look more white than blue. So maybe that's where the discrepancy comes from. But from someone that knew someone that worked on the dress, it actually was blue. Alice also wore a pearl necklace that was a gift from the Cuban government, a diamond brooch from her parents, a diamond bracelets from the Kaiser, and also her groom's wedding present to her, a diamond and pearl necklace. Her wedding bouquet that we have a photograph of there, and also Alice holding it, was composed of rare varieties of white orchids and maidenhair fern in a cascade fashion, which was very popular at the time. And you can see how the blossoms are cascading down, tied to the ribbons cascading down, a very popular bouquet style then. After the wedding, Alice gave flowers from the bouquet to some of her close friends. This is a photograph of what the East Room looked like for the ceremony. They set up a dais along the large windows on the east side of the room. They had palm fronds and Easter lilies and other flowers that decorated the space. Some of the guests included Nellie Grant and Alice's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was actually pregnant at the time of the wedding and did not attend. After the ceremony, the bride and groom retreated to the Blue Room for a private lunch with friends. And when the wedding cake was served, Alice exclaimed to the military guard, "Your sword, your sword." And without any hesitation, she took the weapon and with one sharp thrust of the point into the center of the cake, cut deep into it. Among the gifts that were given to the couple, The Rough Riders sent a silver dinner service, including a platter etched with a relief of Colonel Roosevelt in uniform, which I always think is just what every bride wants, a silver platter with her father's picture on it. I know that would be top on my list for a wedding gift. But I'm sure the president was thrilled with it and thought it was the perfect wedding gift. The next wedding that I want to talk about is Jessie Woodward Wilson and Francis Bowes Sayers, born November 25th, 1913. Their wedding was held in the East Room. Now, the first family really tried very desperately hard to keep the details of this wedding gown a secret, but the press leaked the description of it, and the bride was just devastated by that. Her Baltimore-made gown was simple yet in vogue for the time. It followed her general style, which was described as modish but not extreme. They actually had a double ring ceremony, which was a little bit unusual for the time. They had intricate floral decor in the East Room, and they had Art Nouveau motifs, which was definitely in style at the time. This is a photograph of the wedding party. I love the crowns that the bridesmaids are wearing. That is just amazing. So they posed for their wedding photographs in the residence upstairs at the White House. The bridesmaids wore dresses of charmeuse, a very smooth fabric with a satin weave, draped in chiffon from the shoulders over the bodice in shades of rose. I wish these pictures were in color. That would probably have just been beautiful. The gowns were trimmed in silver lace, which also adorned their crowns that they're wearing. They're actually caps that had the edges turned up like crowns. Here's another photograph of the bride and also of the area set up for this ceremony. Her dress was satin and featured a V neckline embroidered with orange blossom patterns. The skirt of the gown was narrow at the ankle, but had slashes cut in the back that were hidden by the train, which enabled her to walk down the aisle, because dresses at that time were very tight around the ankles. Her veil was made of white tulle and attached to a cap of point lace that matched the gown. The ceremony took place at the altar that we have the picture of there, under thousands of lights mellowed by the sparkle of cut glass ornamentations of the chandeliers. This is a photograph of their wedding cake. It was decorated in the Art Nouveau style, and it was served in the private family dining room to only 20 of the couple's closest friends and family. While the closest friends and family were sharing the wedding cake in the private dining room, there was a party in the state dining room for the rest of the guests. All right, another trivia question. How old was Rosalind Smith Carter the first time Jimmy Carter saw her? I have a little more of my tea. I'll give you a second to think about that. All right, I'm not going to, oh, wait, got somebody. Karen Jacobson says she was a baby, and you are correct. In fact, somebody else said 13. No, Rosalind, I've heard two different stories about exactly how old Rosalind was. Some stories say she was 3 hours old, and some stories say she was 3 days old. So it's one of the two. In any case, extremely young. And the way that that happened is President Carter's mother, Lillian Carter, was a midwife and a nurse, and she actually delivered Rosalind. And after Rosalind was born, Miss Lillian brought her 3-year-old son, Jimmy, to meet the new baby. And so that's how they first saw each other. Isn't that just amazing? And what a love story Rosalind and Jimmy had. Rosalind actually later became very good friends with Jimmy's sister, Ruth Carter. All right. The next wedding is Eleanor Wilson and William McDough on May 7th, 1914. Eleanor was the daughter of President Woodrow Wilson, and she was married in the Blue Room. Now, her wedding was less extravagant than Jessie Wilson's wedding, and it was much more private. By the time Woodrow Wilson became president, McDo was already pursuing Nellie's affections. No one suspected this, including the father of the bride, because at this time, the groom was a 50-year-old grandfather and widower with 6 children. Nellie was only 23. Nellie pulled McDo into the Blue Room to teach him to dance at Jesse's wedding. And things continued to get serious after that. And McDo proposed in January of 1914, and Nellie at first rejected him, but then he proposed a second time, and she said yes. She chose a ivory white satin fabric for the base of her gown, which was custom made by New York designer Charles Kurtzman. The dress featured a V-neck. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. A V-shaped neckline, long sleeves of tulle, and 3.5-foot long train, and was trimmed with rare old point lace sourced from a world-famous collection. She wore a tulle veil attached to a cap with orange blossoms and carried a bouquet of orange blossoms, white lilies of the valley, and white orchids. She and her husband, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, were pictured in this New York Times spread the day after the wedding. And these are the flower girls from the wedding. They were probably dressed in custom Kurzman dresses as well. Kurzman is said to have created the gowns for the bride's trousseau, as well as wedding looks for the entire family. We have Alice Wilson and Isaac Stewart McElroy were married August 7th, 1918. She was the niece of President Woodrow Wilson. The ceremony was performed in front of the long windows in the Blue Room, and the decorations were relatively humble because it was during World War I. There were only 16 guests in attendance, in keeping with the simplicity of the wedding. The New York Times reported that the bride wore a gown of white georgette crepe embroidered in beads and silk threads made over satin, and noted that her tulle veil featured old lace learned to her by the First Lady Ellen Wilson, and orange blossoms that had been worn by the sisters of the groom at their weddings. I saw someone comment that the previous bride was the first one that was smiling. Don't forget, in earlier pictures, in earlier times, it was difficult to smile for pictures because you had to pose still for so long for the image to be made. So maybe that's part of the reason that she was the first one that was smiling. This wedding is the wedding of Harry Hopkins, who was an advisor to President Roosevelt, and he married Louise Gill Macy in the Yellow Oval Room. He was an American social worker who was one of President Roosevelt's closest advisors and one of the architects of the New Deal. The relationship between him and FDR was so close that when he married his third wife, FDR allowed the wedding to take place in the White House. And this is a photograph of the wedding party. Now we're coming into a little bit more modern weddings, and we have come to August 6, 1966. Lucy Baines Johnson, the daughter of President Lyndon Johnson, married Patrick Nugent at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, with a reception for 700 guests held later that day in the White House. Lucy said, "I only want as personal a wedding as possible in the circumstances in which I find myself." Lucy's dress was a princess-seamed A-line skirt of English net, long sleeves, high collar, and a 9-foot Watteau train, all created out of the finest French lace. The train was detachable and flowed from the mid-back. To capture this unique placement, Priscilla, the designer, designed a bubble veil that poofed up, out, and under, not down, and it was lightly fastened just at the top of the train. These are some photographs from the actual wedding ceremony that took place at the church. The wedding was broadcast to 55 million viewers and was also depicted in Life magazine, which is where these photographs come from. And a couple other photographs from the ceremony. And now we have photographs of the bride and groom arriving back from the ceremony to the White House, and with her parents, and with the famous beagles, him and her. I don't know if you remember those beagles that the Johnsons had, but that is him and her there in the photographs. There were 12 bridesmaids for this wedding. They wore azalea pink gowns, also designed by Priscilla. They were done in moire. They had A-line skirts that were corded, and the girls carried tiny nosegays of pink sweetheart roses. They wore wrist-length kid leather gloves and floor-length pink tulle veils. And I just love the picture of all of them posing on the stairs there of the portico. The afternoon ceremony was followed by the reception at the White House. They had an 8-foot wedding cake, and this is a picture of them cutting that wedding cake. We have the other Johnson daughter, Linda Bird, and she married Marine Captain Charles Spittle Robb on December 9th, 1967, and their ceremony was held in the East Room. Jeffrey Bean was the designer of Linda Bird's gown and of the bridesmaids' gowns. The bride and the designer exchanged multiple sketches before arriving at the final result, a white silk A-line paneled dress with delicate silk floss embroidery. Her dress and the red medieval-inspired bridesmaids' gowns paired beautifully with the white and red poinsettias, carnations, and evergreen branches adorned with sparkling lights that were part of the White House decoration for the holiday season. Following the ceremony, the couple enjoyed the company of 500 guests, including celebrities and former White House bride Alice Roosevelt, who told Linda Bird that she had never seen a prettier wedding. Here is the president and Linda Bird coming down the grand staircase to go to the ceremony. And also Linda and her groom exiting the ceremony. After the ceremony, the newlyweds walked under an arch of sabers held by members of the Marine Corps on their way to the Yellow Oval Room for wedding portraits. Here is the wedding portrait of the wedding party. The bridesmaids are wearing red velvet dresses that they were inspired by the medieval aesthetic that was very popular at the time. It was popularized by the 1967 film Camelot. And very pretty bridesmaids dresses, in my opinion. And here is the designer holding a Linda Bird's veil before the ceremony. It was made of silk illusion and attached to the coronet, made of the same silk satin fabric and embroidery of her gown. We have Tricia Nixon and Edward Finch Cox, married June 12th, 1971, in the first outdoor wedding at the White House. Tricia's wedding ensemble is actually now on display at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in California. That is it on display there and also on the cover of Life with Tricia wearing it. The bridal look was designed by Priscilla Kidder, and Tricia definitely had input on it as well. It was a white crepe molded underslip overlaid by illusory layers of silk organza, and incorporated a sleeveless patterned lace bodice with a V neckline, a trumpet-style skirt with a court train, and swaths of embroidered floral motifs. She had a Juliet cap and an illusion silk veil, and the cap was made in the same mode as the gown with matching appliqued roses of lace and embroidered lilies of the valley. And the veil was embellished with pearls throughout. There is a sketch that the designer made of the dress, and then Tricia wearing the dress, of course. She did incorporate something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. Her something old was her engagement ring, which had belonged to the groom's grandmother. Her something new was the dress, as it is for many brides. Her something borrowed was her sister's diamond and pearl drop earrings. And her something blue was an inscription inside her dress in blue thread. Now, when I'll tell you what the inscription said, and it always makes me laugh because it is so long. The inscription in blue thread inside the gown read, "Gown by Priscilla of Boston for the White House marriage of Tricia Nixon to Edward Finch Cox, June 12, 1971. Whew, that's a lot to embroider inside a dress. Now, despite some pushback from security concerns, including those from the FBI. Trisha insisted on having the ceremony in the Rose Garden, and I think she was right that these pictures of the wedding are just beautiful. Here's another picture of the wedding ceremony, just a gorgeous place for a ceremony. And here is the wedding party, posing for photographs in the blue room after the ceremony. The bridesmaids were draped in pastel. Priscilla of Boston provided layered silk organdy dresses with corresponding floppy hats to top off the look. And here is Trisha dancing with her groom at the reception and cutting their cake at the reception. The wedding of Tony Rodham, who was the brother of Hillary Clinton. He married Nicole Boxer in the Rose Garden on May 28th, 1994. There's not a lot of information about this wedding, except that 250 people attended, which featured Jewish and Methodist characteristics. Now we come to weddings in the 21st century. The first one is Pete Souza and Patty Leese, October 20th, 2013. Again, there's not a lot of information about this wedding, but Pete Souza was the official White House photographer, and he married his fiancée on a Saturday in a small wedding hosted by the Obamas in the Rose Garden. And we have finally the most recent White House wedding. Naomi Biden and Peter Neal were married November 19th, 2022. Naomi is the granddaughter of President Joe Biden. They were married on the lawn of the White House, and her wedding was the first wedding of a grandchild of a president at the White House. Naomi had a high neck, long sleeve Chantilly lace Ralph Lauren dress, and she carried a bouquet of sweet peas and lilies of the valley. She was accompanied down the aisle by her parents to a string quartet playing Bittersweet Symphony. They exchanged their vows on the White House South Lawn in front of more than 200 guests. Her sister Finnegan served as maid of honor, and her groom's brother, Robert, was the best man. The other bridesmaids included her other sister, Maisie, and Peter's sister, Betsy. Here are some pictures of the bride and her groom, and then posing with the president and first lady. And then of the bride and groom on the stairs of the portico. I think it was just decorated beautifully. In the evening, the guests returned to the White House for a black tie reception with dancing, cake cutting, and all that fun stuff, said Naomi. She actually changed her dress for the reception. She wore a strapless ivory silk dress with her grandmother Roberta Boole's pearls sewn into the sweeping train. They climbed a ladder to be able to cut their 7-foot-tall, 8-tier lemon cake with buttercream frosting. And that is what we have, and we're right at 6:30, but I'll ask if anybody has any questions or comments.
Do you want me to let people unmute themselves?
If they'd like to unmute themselves, or if they'd rather type something into the comments, that's fine too. Either way, sometimes people don't want to talk, but they don't mind typing in. So I'll be looking at the chat as well. While you're typing, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for attending. I always enjoy talking to you over Zoom. I hope you enjoyed. And somebody says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the compliment very much. You know, make sure to let your libraries know what kind of programs you're interested in. They only book what you like if they know what you like. So, I mean, even if it's not my programs, which, you know, I love when they book me, but even other programs, let them know what you want to see. And thank you for supporting your library. I think libraries are wonderful places, not just because I work with them. I always have. Any questions, comments? Erica says, a fun, interesting presentation, learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you, Erica.
Valerie, any anecdotes on who had happy marriages and be someone who didn't?
The early ones all stayed married, whether they were happy or not. I know that Nellie Grant and Alice Roosevelt both did not have happy marriages. Unfortunately. Two of the most well-known presidential daughters, unfortunately. Now I'm trying to remember which of, because one of the Johnson girls and one of the Nixon girls are still married and the other ones are divorced, and I can't remember which are which. I want to say that Trisha is still married, and Linda Bird is still married. I'm probably getting that wrong. I'm sorry if I am.
I looked it up. Linda is still married.
Okay, I was right on
She's
that.
80
Good,
years old.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Julie,
she's
somebody is saying Julie Eisenhower. Is Julie Eisenhower, are you saying she's still married? I think, I'm not sure on that. I think she is.
Someone asked in the chat if there is a museum of White House brides.
There is not a museum of White House brides, unfortunately. Sometimes, like, Trisha's dress is at her father's presidential museum. You might find some dresses, maybe at other presidential libraries. But since a lot of the brides aren't necessarily family members, there's really no place. I was going to say the First Ladies Library, but that's not true because there's only two First Ladies that were married while their husband was president. And the First Ladies Library doesn't have either of those dresses. So yeah, unfortunately, there really isn't any museum of it. You kind of have to find the information from all different sources. And somebody verified that Julie Eisenhower is still married, but her sister is divorced. So it seems like well, I call them modern presidents, but that was 50 years ago, wasn't it? It seems like modern presidents have 50-50 of their children staying married. Karen says, very intriguing. Thank you, Karen. I'm fascinated by anything about, you know, the presidents and their children and stuff. That's the stuff that I'm interested in. So I'm glad to hear that you're all interested in it too. Johnson and Rob still married. He was a senator. Okay, that's good to know.
very good.
Anything else, anybody? I don't want to keep you here. I'm sure y'all have other things to do, but again, thank you for coming. I hope I will see you all again soon. Would love to do more presentations. I'm sure your librarians know I have a huge list of programs all about presidents and first ladies and children and the Victorian times. And I also do programs on Walt Disney World. So, you know, like I said, even if they're not those topics, let your librarians know what you're interested in. So.
Okay.
All right, everybody. I think we'll call it. And thanks again. Everybody have a good rest of your evening and take care until I see you again.